Ta-da! We are here. Hi, Suze.
Hi. Good evening.
Very formal of you. Bringing in
Good evening.
good evening.
Happy.
Bringing in some good vibes in 2021.
Yes,
Holler.
indeed. Happy Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. We are going into Boundaries Part 2.
Yes.
And that's pretty friggin' exciting because we did an episode on setting the guidelines for your worth, which are boundaries, in 2020, the end of 2020, last episode of the You Relationship podcast for 2020. And there was so much that came up in that episode and so much great conversation and content. And coming out of that, we're like, we need to do another episode on this. Like, there's so much more to say. And let's bring it to the people and see what their questions are and what their comments are and where they struggle with setting boundaries. So here we are doing it.
Yes. Yeah, it's just such a universal challenge. Like we can all relate on that level so much. And it's been a lifelong process for me. I mean, for most of us, I'm sure. Like I feel like I just figured out boundaries like in my adult years, like in my last few years.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, this is a thing and it's very important.
Did you have any boundary stuff come up over the holidays?
Um, you know what? I would say that I did in like a successful way because I set the boundary at the outset, or the intention, I guess, to spend New Year's by myself. I was excited to spend it in my own company. And I, I did see my parents over the holiday, like for Christmas, but I wasn't sure if, I was going to feel like I should spend New Year's with them so that they're not alone, or like if I would give in to stories about me being alone. But I was just like, no, I'm going to honor the decision to spend it on my own. So like I let them know right away, I'm going to spend New Year's by myself. Um,
Love
and I
that.
did. Yeah, I did. And sorry, what did you say? How was that?
No, I said I love that. Like,
Oh.
and was it received in a positive way? Like, were the
Yeah.
boundaries honored? Or
Yeah. My parents totally honored it. My mom's reaction was just kind of like, we mentioned it in like a live we did the other day, you and I, but my mom was like, just don't get like too comfortable being alone. And I was like, okay. It's like, I'll be okay. Don't worry. It's good and healthy to spend time with myself. But even if I did choose to be alone, like that's my prerogative. Like if I chose to just be a single person for life,
Agreed.
Not that I don't know why I'm taking it all the way there, but yeah.
Well, because that's where your mom's fears are coming from, right? Like it's going to be something
Right.
extreme. Like you're never going to find a partner now because you're going to be so comfortable being alone.
Yes.
And like it starts here, New Year's by yourself. Next thing you know, you're, on your deathbed and you never had a partner.
You're regretting it. Yeah. The deathbed regret is like the constant thing people wave over your head. Like, yeah. So yeah, I feel like I, I did a couple Zoom calls that night, but otherwise I was on my own and I felt really good. And compared to times where I've like violated that kind of decision where I had that intention, but then in the end I gave in to a different outcome and felt really bad about it. This was like a success where boundaries are considered. So
yay.
I pat myself on the back.
Good job. That's a good back pat.
What about you?
Not really. I didn't really have boundary stuff come up, probably because I didn't see family. That helps. Usually they're the ones pushing boundaries. Actually, I did set some boundaries with myself. So something that I committed to doing was taking a proper holiday break and not working.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and when you work for yourself, you kind of feel like you could be working all the time, and there's this guilt that comes up. And I said, no, I'm making this time sacred, and I'm not going to work.
Yeah.
I did have like client sessions that were like pre-scheduled, but outside of that, and it felt really good. I was able to
Mhm.
reconnect with myself, gain like more inspiration for my business, just relax and chill and not have a schedule, which was really fun.
Yes.
Yeah, so it ended up being a really, really great holiday break, and I'm really happy that I did it.
I did it too. Like I also had several days where I was just like, girl, you're going to do nothing. You're going to watch as much
Mm.
TV and movies as you want. And every day I did have this nagging little thing, like this thought that was just like, you have ample time right now to do this, this, and that. And I'd be like, no, this is my time to do nothing. And doing nothing is also important and special. So,
Totally. I think that's
yeah.
the best feeling of the holiday break. I remember feeling that when I had a corporate job too. Like we would typically be off on the holidays, and it would feel so good to just
Hmm.
do nothing. But yeah, amazing. Well, I'm happy to hear that. And I'm sure the listeners and the viewers have had probably some of your own boundary stuff coming up over the holidays, and maybe you were able to address it or set them with confidence, or maybe you struggled a little bit. But either way, I feel like there'll definitely be some good kind of points of reference and content in this episode for helping you in general when it comes to boundaries.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
just laughing because my cat is on cue to interrupt.
Perfect. I love it.
um, yeah, it's funny because actually I forgot one boundary I did struggle with was with social media over the holidays, was like
Mm.
not spending too much time browsing, like using it and expressing myself on it is not so much the problem, but yeah, I definitely had to reel in some of my phone time. That was a thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm curious, for those listening, if you ended up spending more or less time on social media over the
Mhm.
holidays.
Me too.
Yeah. So, all right, should we get into it? Like,
Yes. Yeah. Like, so, I mean, both of us gave our audiences the opportunity to ask questions, right? You
yeah.
got some in and I got some in. So, questions, and also, like, I was asking for just any challenges or successes people have had. And I got a lot of aligned answers, like a lot of people experiencing similar things across the board and that I could relate to also.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, that is what we did.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
So we
so
can
what,
kind of go through. Yeah. Sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
So one of the questions that came up, which I really, really liked, and this was actually something that came through in my DMs, was what is the difference between boundaries and expectations?
Mhm.
And I loved that question because to this person asking, they're like, aren't they the same thing? And it's like, no, they are not the same thing. They're very different. And ultimately, what comes to me, and I would love your take on it, is when you put your expectations on people or on situations, you're putting your energy outwards. You're giving your power to other people, right? You're like,
Mm.
I expect this from you. So here you go. Here's my expectation. Please cherish it, like, and they're like, okay, thanks for your expectation. You may have not even told them, and they do whatever they want with it. And you just deal with the consequences.
Mhm.
Whereas when you set a boundary, the boundary is yours. It's your protection. It's your shield. And it brings the power back to you.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, it doesn't matter nobody can take your boundary away from you or drop your boundary. Your boundary is there. You own it. You manage it. You're responsible for it. Whereas an expectation, someone else takes it and runs with it. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's exactly hitting the nail on the head. Like, I completely agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I guess I can kind of see how they're similar only in the way that both are something that you express. Like, you express a boundary, you express an expectation,
Mm-hmm.
but an expectation has no guarantee of being met,
Mm-hmm.
whereas a boundary, like, should be met. Does that make sense? Like, that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
how I see it. Like, an expectation's like a hope, like you're putting it out there and you're like, I expect this, and like, this is what my hope is. Um, whereas a boundary is like, this is a line that you cannot cross, or like,
Mm-hmm.
this is a space that I'm creating for myself. And you need to respect that in order not to violate me. You know?
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah.
Whereas if someone doesn't meet my expectation, like, they might disappoint me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there might be disappointment there.
For sure.
Um, and then there's things around obviously expressing expectations, like if we've been clear and stated them, because we have both talked about that in the past, like how you can, have expectations that are unmet that you have not expressed, and then you're upset over something that you haven't even put out there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I love the way that you put it.
Hmm.
Very
Yeah,
cute.
I remember honestly feeling like there was a time in my life where I had a lot of expectations from people and I was constantly disappointed. It's
Mhm.
like pretty much a guarantee that you will be disappointed because, again, you're giving your power away and you're putting something on somebody else,
Yeah,
um, versus creating a boundary in a sacred space for you that you man and manage. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Kind of like, this is a weird example maybe, but just because we're on the holiday, we're talking about the holidays. Like, I often have an expectation for New Year's to go really, really
Mm,
well. But let's say like a boundary would be that I don't like being in a room that's crowded with people.
mhm.
So I will not enter a room for New Year's, or maybe I have to leave the room if it's really crowded with people. That's me expressing and honoring a boundary. The expectation that New Year's has to be amazing is just a lofty
Totally.
expectation. It may or may not be met. I mean, there are obviously valid expectations. Like, that one's a little bit abstract, so it's hard to meet. Like, I'm
But
kind of just putting it out to the universe and asking the universe to meet my expectation.
but I think like the boundaries will like set the parameters so that you can have a really happy New Year's, right? It
Yes.
brings it back to what are my needs? What do I enjoy? Like, what do I need to be happy and have a good time?
Right.
Like, not be around a bunch of people, maybe limit the amount of alcohol I drink, maybe whatever it might be. And then it's like, okay, if I set these boundaries in and these parameters in place, then I'm more likely to have a great New Year's. But expecting it, it's like we're not fortune tellers. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. So I love that question. I thought it was great. It really brought me back to a place where I did have a lot of expectations of things, and I definitely still notice them coming up here and there, and
Hmm.
usually just results in me being disappointed.
I could almost see it as like a math equation. I hate math and I'm not good at math, but like, boundaries like not equal greater than expect, you know what I mean? Like, I want to
Totally.
see a formula comparing boundaries
I
and
love that.
expectations.
I do love that. Something else that came up as a question was, why is it hard to set boundaries? This was
Yeah.
one of yours that you received. So, like, do you want to go into a little bit more detail on this
Yeah.
one?
So they mentioned things like, Yeah, for sure. So there was like a couple points. I think it was from two different people, but they were saying similar things for different reasons. And the baseline being how it's difficult to set boundaries. And some of the reasons for that are like the fear of upsetting somebody or someone having like an adverse reaction to it. And that could be them getting angry or like, just reactionary and what do you call it? Like retaliatory. Is
Yeah,
that a word?
I think so.
Um, as well as losing somebody or, getting like opening yourself up to distance with a person because you've set that boundary and now they're going to be like, oh, well, I don't want to be as close anymore. It hurts your relationship in some way. And yeah, like one of the people who brought that up had a great example of just like in their experience, they had, like a primary giver, like a parent who did react really negatively whenever they set boundaries, like as a child and adolescent and growing up. And so they just sort of like went through life expecting that most people are going to react that way when they set a boundary. But then in reality, a lot of people actually don't. So what they were, avoiding to sort of like avoid conflict and avoid those repercussions or the loss of those relationships, like they didn't need to be doing it. Um, and we're sort of like pleasantly surprised that not everybody was, acting like their primary giver when it came to setting boundaries. And then the key to that is then recognizing that the reaction their primary giver would have growing up was actually toxic and unhealthy. That's not a healthy way to react to boundaries. So if somebody gets angry at you or reacts in a negative way or puts you down or tries to like manipulate you or gaslight you for setting a boundary, that's a problematic behavior. And, of course, like we talked about it in the previous episode a bit, I think, we all can be like triggered by boundaries when we're on the receiving end. So there is some room and space for people to just like feel it out and process it. But at the end of the day, like your boundary is your call, and it needs to be respected.
Yeah. And something that comes up for me with that question as well is you actually, and I love this example because it actually brings me to a conversation I had with a guy that I'm talking to right now. Okay. It's kind of like the perfect example. So like, thank you for that scenario. So it's, you are not responsible for how other people feel.
I need to like drill that into my head.
Yes,
because I struggle with that so much.
I know. It's like tattooing that somewhere, right? Or putting it somewhere you look every day. Like that is a codependent behavior of feeling like you are responsible. So when I set a boundary, this is how it makes another person feel. Like, whoa, that boundary is not for them. That boundary is for you. And just to give a really brief example of this conversation that I had with this guy, he was like, oh, I have this tendency of feeling like I need to take care of other people's emotions. And I said, well, first of all, you're not responsible for how I feel. So don't worry about that. Like, you're responsible for your own emotions. I'm responsible for my own. But I do ask you to be considerate of how I feel.
Right.
So, and it gives it a different energy, right? So it's like you can set your boundary and be aware that someone may respond to it in a certain way. Be considerate of maybe how you communicate it, or, that maybe it will be triggering for them, but that doesn't mean do not set the boundary.
Exactly. That's kind of the bottom line, is like, you can have that awareness and take note of those experiences, but don't let it prevent you from like identifying, setting, and sticking to that boundary, because you need to do
Yes.
it for your own health and well-being. And the onus is on the other person, on the receiving end, after hearing your boundary, to process whatever triggers or emotions come up around it, and then come around to either accept your boundary or accept, unfortunately, like the consequences. It sounds
Mm,
harsh, but if somebody in your life isn't willing to honor what boundary you put out, they may not, like, like, you're worried about creating distance with somebody for expressing it and having them pull away from you. If they don't honor your boundaries, like, especially if it's like a regular thing, like, distance might be something you want to consider anyways, because you don't really want somebody in your life who's constantly going to make you feel, wrong, or whatever, for stating these things that you have a right to state, you know?
yeah, totally. I feel like this whole topic of honest, open communication is coming up for me a lot. I think just in my dating experiences and like being upfront with things. And
Mm-hmm.
there is this underlying fear of, how is this person going to respond? Are they not going to want to talk to me any longer? Are they going to get mad at me? And like the examples would be something that I have recently vowed to do is not ghost people on the apps anymore. So like, if I'm
Mm,
not feeling the conversation, even if it's early days, what I would normally do is just be like, and like unmatch, or like, and stop communicating with them. And then I was on the receiving end of that. And I'm like, ooh, like that fucking hurts.
mm,
Like what happened there, And I know in my mind, it's like, it's their stuff or whatever, like, but that hurts. So something that I've been doing, and it's been so amazing to see, and I know this will roll into another thing that we're going to talk about in today's episode, is literally say to them, if it's a distance thing, like, hey, I just noticed like how far you live. I'm not sure that it makes sense for us to explore this connection. I'm looking for someone who lives close. I think you're amazing, but like, I feel like it would be good for us to go our separate ways. And then I
mm-hmm.
don't unmatch them. I like leave an opening for them to
For
respond.
closure. Yeah.
And and like, that's one example. Or someone else, it's like, I'm not feeling like that chemistry with you, or I'm not feeling the compatibility. Like, people are so responsive and so nice when you do that, which for me is
Yeah.
shocking, because I expect to get shat on and burned and like yelled at. Um, so again, and that's my own childhood stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
patterning, and belief systems and all of that. But it's the same thing with boundaries too. It's like, I think sometimes we also expect people to respond a certain way to our boundaries,
Yes.
but when we actually communicate them, and communicate them from a loving way where it's about you and not about them,
Mm.
then they're way more likely to receive it, right? So if you're like, I feel like I need this in my life, and not be like, I'm trying to think of an example that I could use. You know, I don't like getting phone calls after 9 p.m., for example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say it's that. So someone who calls me consistently at 11 o'clock, like, I could call them up and say, hey, you know what, Suze, like, you need to stop calling me after 11 o'clock. Like, that's not cool. That's really inconsiderate of my time. And like, I just want to get some sleep. And you're
Yeah.
like, what the fuck?
Instant fighting words.
Instant fighting words. Whereas if I said to you, I was like, hey, just letting you know, my sleep is really important to me. And I'm going to be honoring my time after 9 o'clock being a phone free time. So you
Mm-hmm.
may not hear from me, or I may not pick up if you call me, or I won't pick up if you call me after 9, or text me after 9. Then how different does that feel? That has nothing to do with
Exactly.
you. Yeah.
Yeah. It has a
Uh,
completely different energy. Completely.
totally.
Yes. Yeah, the way we communicate the boundary is really important, and that it is coming from a place of love. And um to what you brought up about the dating apps, like, I can you know, another part to that same thought that I was receiving from these same people was that, you know, like there's people who in response to you stating a boundary like that might manipulate you or try to gaslight you or twist it
Mm-hmm.
to seem like it's irrational or, you know, like not respectable, or that there's some, or it's silly, or it's like over the top. um and like when you mention, you know, saying these things to people that you match with, that's the first thought that comes up for me, and I think is just my own thing, is, and I think is a driver for why we typically are more comfortable, not like we all are, but maybe why a lot of people ghost, is like to avoid that kind of interaction. Is like if I said something like, oh, I feel like we have a lot of distance, you live in another city, I don't know if I can make that work. And then they might come back and be like, of course we can make it work. Like we can do long distance, we can like blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, oh, I have to have a whole like long-winded conversation about something that I already made a decision about.
Mm.
But I think the verbiage and the way we word things is really important. And
Yeah.
like the assertiveness that
Yes.
comes with it, right?
That's the key. It's the assertiveness. Cause I would notice I would try and like formulate, and I'd sometimes be like, yeah, I'm thinking like maybe it would be best if we, and I'm like, and I would like would reread my message and be like, okay, no, that is way too fluffy and way too uncertain. Like I need to be assertive and say,
Yeah.
I don't feel like I don't feel like this is going to work for me, and like wishing you the best. Or if you want a
Yeah.
friendship, like propose a friendship or whatever. And I've had people respond and be like I've said, I'm not feeling, this actually just happened today, like I'm not feeling a romantic connection, and but like I think you're great, cool that we have this in common, wishing you all the best in your journey. And his response was, how are you supposed to have a romantic connection this early in a conversation? Ha ha. But was like totally cool and honored the boundary, you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
was like wishing you all the best. And I said, thanks. Like didn't even address the passive comment, you know what I
Right,
mean?
right. Because that's the thing, like that comment would like, I just, I'd get sucked into wanting
Mm,
to, or I'd feel like they're not respecting what I just said. But I
mm,
think you're right. Like I think the way you're describing going about it is really helpful, where you already stated your decision, you were courteous to just like let them know. Um, and you don't need to keep engaging after that. Then you
exactly.
can unmatch. Like you're good, you know?
Exactly. Like your boundary can be, one of your boundaries with your boundaries can say, I state my boundary twice.
Yeah.
And if that's still not honored after the second time and not received, like just even in the conversation of it, then I stop talking about it and I like move away from that person or
Mhm.
whatever it is. So setting boundaries with ourselves is also really good and really supportive.
For sure.
Yeah.
And for the record, like somebody who is going to turn it around against you, manipulate you, gaslight you, or just make you feel stupid for it, like red flag, and like
Totally.
walk the other way. Like it's kind of a good test. Or just like, you know, a good way to see how somebody responds to a boundary like that early on that you're seeing or talking to.
Totally.
Because that shouldn't be a common reaction. Like you shouldn't be, you know, made to feel like you're, I don't know, like crazy or insecure or
Totally.
demanding or bitchy for for setting a boundary.
100%. And I've definitely cut people off when they reacted to my boundary in an extreme way and came at me over it. And I was like, wow, okay, like thank
Mhm.
you. I see your true colors.
Absolutely.
But like if you can't honor my boundaries, then you can't honor me. And I'm not going to be feeling safe or happy or healthy in this relationship.
Yeah.
Which can be really awkward if someone's had a parent or a history of that kind of dynamic. But it's like just notice it within yourself look back on your prior relationships, friendships, whatever. What has the energy been like when you've set a boundary? And are people consistently reacting in the same way? Then you need to come back to yourself and say, well, also, how firm am I in my boundaries?
Yeah.
And are there consequences? A boundary is bullshit if there isn't a consequence.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
If you just say, I have this boundary, and I notice I do that sometimes, but like, I have this boundary of like not watching TV or something after 10 o'clock, and then I break the boundary because there's like a really good show on, or I'm like sucked into something, or I'm not tired. I'm like, well, I just broke that boundary. So that boundary has lost its power.
Mhm.
And it's not really a boundary if I'm not honoring it. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, there's some work to do there
Yeah. Yeah.
on your
Yeah.
own.
It kind of segues into another point somebody made as well. That was about like it's again connected to that whole idea, but you know, there's this hesitation that I think some of us feel around being assertive and declaring something
Mm-hmm.
explicitly like that, especially verbally.
Mm-hmm.
Out of like, I don't know, as women, and not strictly women, but I think it's very common for women. We have this thing about not seeming like mean, rude, or bitchy. You know, we want to be polite, especially like in this particular comment. It's like in a situation where somebody's hitting on you or making an advance that you're not comfortable with, and the common response that we like all know so well among our girlfriends is, you know, we'll kind of like be like, I have a boyfriend, even if we don't.
Mm-hmm.
um or just like, I've absolutely done this in my life. I'm pretty sure in my younger years, like given a fake number.
Mm-hmm.
And God, I think last time I gave a fake number, I wrote it down, which is a testament to how long ago that was. Because it was not in a phone. But
Oh, you
I mean,
wrote it down for the person you were giving the
yeah, like
number
I
to.
wrote
Oh,
it down
got
on a
it.
piece of
Yeah, yeah.
paper. And yeah, like I've been there where you're just like, why is it that in a situation where we have every right to say no because we're not interested, like we'll lie sooner than just flat out being like, no, thank you, I'm not interested. And I think that there is a layer to this of self-preservation and protection as a
Yeah,
woman,
totally.
because like around a man in like the heteronormative side of things, you could feel like you're vulnerable to retaliation, to attack, to the guy lashing out of like the anger of feeling rejected. And it's a reality that we live with every day. So
Great.
there's that whole aspect to it. But I think that it does flow into other areas of our life where we kind of have this like fear of, you know, sounding mean or like rude or whatever.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of being a good girl. Like we're
Mhm.
taught to be good girls. It's like, Mom, I don't want to sit on that uncle's lap. Like, be a good
Oof.
girl. Go sit on their lap, you know? Be a good girl, be polite, do what people say, like don't protest it. And it's like, okay, that's a huge issue on so many levels where women
Yeah.
are not feeling confident in their no's and being able to say them clearly. And our no's have also been disrespected over generations and generations as women, where our physical power was taken away from us and we've encountered abuse and other things as a collective.
Mhm.
um, so it makes sense. Like it makes sense that we feel uncomfortable saying no. I remember having a whole situation around, this is like me in my 20s, yeah, where I was at a club. I had a boyfriend, but he was my ex-boyfriend at that time. We were always on and off. And a guy at the club asked me for my number. I didn't want to give him my number. I wanted to give him a fake number, but I was scared that he would check my number in front of me and that
Wow.
might cause issues. So I gave him my real number. Then he ended up calling me all the time. I never picked up.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then it was New Year's Eve, and me and my boyfriend were back together. And I was in the shower, and my phone rang, and my boyfriend picked up, and it was that guy being like, "Hey, do you know what Maria's doing tonight for New Year's?" My boyfriend got so mad at me. He ended up being like mad at me the whole night. It was like the worst New
Oh my
Year's.
gosh.
I wasn't 20 yet. I was 18 because I remember my ID got peeled at the door going into Money nightclub in Toronto, but they
Funny.
let me in. I wasn't even
We used
20
to
yet.
go to Money. Oh my God.
Um, but it turned into a whole thing.
Yeah.
And then we ended up bumping into this guy later at a party, like a year later in Woodbridge. And that guy
No
was there.
way.
Yeah. So crazy how that all
Like it
happened.
just, wow. From that, yeah, it just kept going.
So from
Oh my
that, so anyway, it's a
gosh.
very random story. I kind of forgot about that until
Yeah,
now, but especially when you don't say the no up front, then it can get so messy as it continues,
absolutely.
right? Like it can turn into a really big thing.
And at
Um,
a point, like for him to be calling you and you to have to feel like you have to ignore those calls. And then it gets to a point where, your boyfriend like picks up it's like you're already dealing with so much. Like I know it wasn't like a lot of pain and suffering, but there is pain and suffering attached to this idea that this guy just like is not getting the point. And it's yeah. And like we could eradicate that in the moment just by being like, no, thanks. But then you don't know what's going to happen at the end of that no either. So sometimes we're willing to risk some of our own suffering and prolonging that suffering for the idea of staying safe, you know?
yeah, the safety thing is huge. It's so huge for us as women, like
Yeah.
especially. Um, because I know I've said no to guys or like ignored guys who are like hollering at me while I'm like walking through Peanut Plaza. Suzanna and I used to live in the same area, and like walking from
Yeah.
the bus stop, and I'm like speed walking, and there's guys hanging out. Again, this is me in like my teenage years, but them hooting and hollering at me and me ignoring them and them getting aggressive and starting to
Mhm.
like name call and say hurtful things. And it's like we feel that like that's like also like ingrained in our nervous systems, like collectively as women. um
Absolutely.
so it's understandable if you have a hard time saying no, like please don't beat yourself up over it, but it's also kind of building your trust in yourself and in your safety as
Mhm.
well, and maybe changing the narrative as well from when I express my no, it is respected and it is honored,
Right.
versus like when I say no, people get upset.
Mhm.
Change the dialogue and you'll actually start noticing how people will start responding in a respectful and honoring way, especially because your energy will be very different when you express a no from a loving, like I feel safe place versus a I'm scared, I don't want to get a reaction place. And the energy that we give off when we are saying things gets like gets picked up on. Like people feel that even more than your words. So it's like you can
Mhm.
say the exact same thing from two different energies and you're going to get two different responses from the same person. So if you
Yeah.
go into it like confident but like not confrontational but assertive and saying that doesn't feel good, or that makes me feel uncomfortable, or I don't feel safe right now, like that's going to trigger someone to be like, oh shit, like what am I doing? I'm making a woman feel unsafe. Oh my God, I feel terrible. And they'll probably start
Totally.
reversing back.
Yeah.
Or if we're like, like, I no, I don't know. Then they're like, what's going on? Like, they'll probably lean in and
Mhm.
try and figure it out and like maybe pry more, and then you freak out more. And, so
Yeah.
being aware of that energy is a really big one.
Yeah. Ugh, and I just like, yeah, the catcalling thing, it's just that is why it's so important for men to understand why it's problematic to catcall women, because so many men will kind of be like, what's the problem? Like, I just want to compliment
Mhm.
a pretty lady. It's like, you don't understand how layered it is and
Yeah.
like how much there is to it when like from a young, like think about it, in high school we were like between 14 or let's say 15 and 18 years old. Those are the years where I would like walk to and from school and I'd get honked at and hollered at every single day,
Hmm.
because like I think you too, we went to like a school that had uniforms, and like
Hmm.
we all know how sexualized like
The
the
kilt is,
the
yeah.
kilt, like the uniform is, which is
Hmm.
a whole other thing. Like it's kind of funny to me. That's the whole other topic. Um, but yeah, so you feel like a target, you're vulnerable, you're still a child and you're being catcalled. And then you're supposed to, into your womanhood, like appreciate a guy hollering at you on the street. No, no.
Yeah.
Um, and many times it has gone wrong for women and does, so, but I think I love what you said about the energy, and the vibration, and just changing the mindset, because I don't want to walk around constantly fearing for my safety and resisting the no as like something that's going to put me in danger, when it
Mm.
is important for me to honor my no as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like somebody who's like, you know, unaware or might intentionally or unintentionally bring about harm, like um sorry, someone who's intentionally going to bring about harm is going to do so regardless of
Yeah.
how, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether I say no or not is not going to necessarily change the outcome.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'd rather operate under the notion that my no is an honorable, sacred thing that I have a right to put out there that
Mhm.
needs to be respected. And yeah, it's such an important point. Um yeah.
Yeah.
Oof.
Mhm. It's big stuff for sure. It's big. Um, Something that had come up too, I know in some of your conversations, was the aspect of like boundaries and sex.
Mhm.
Um, and that can be very awkward. Like awkward in the sense of you're in a sexual situation with someone and you don't want to kill the mood, right?
Yes. Yes.
And by saying like, no, I don't like that, or no, that's a boundary for me. Um, so I think there's a few ways that you can address it. You can talk about it up front. Like if you have a hard boundary of like, maybe you don't want anything to do with anal, for example. Like I
Mhm.
know a lot of women aren't like the biggest fans, or maybe I just think that. And a lot of men are like thinking that's great. Like maybe up front, if you're worried, like, oh no, I don't know what I'm going to do when it gets to that situation, like maybe you actually talk about some of your boundaries up front before you sleep with someone. Like, yeah, sure, it's not the sexiest conversation, but if you're going to talk about, sex safety and condom use and all of that, then like
Mhm.
why not also have some conversations around like, hey, just want to let you know this is a no-go for me. Can you honor that?
Yeah.
Before you're now in a situation and like someone's like surprises you or
Yeah.
is leaning
Catches you
that
off
way.
guard.
And if that conversation doesn't happen up front, then it literally comes down to practice and just
Yeah.
saying like either saying no or like also just like giving like a loud response of like ugh or like or whatever.
Yeah. And we do things like non-verbally. I know that we all do this when we don't want to say it, like we will react physically and recoil or turn or like change position or do something when something's not going right or feeling good. And that's tricky because it's not necessarily noticeable to the other person.
It's not clear.
And I completely get that fear or idea that like it feels like it's just a turn off to be like, I don't like that or do this differently. But I think it's really important to practice that voice and build confidence around it, because it can be like, it shouldn't matter if it's sexy or not, because if someone's like going to town on you, like, and they're putting on like way too much pressure or not enough pressure or whatever it is, like, you know, I'd want to know if I'm doing if something I'm doing is way off,
or if you're not liking it. Yeah, I'd want to know too. Are you not? But then,
like, I know I would feel a little embarrassed. Like I would feel some shame at like, oh God, I'm doing it wrong, you know. But there's a way to do it. I don't know. Like it's like you could be in a situation where you're just like, you turn it into more of a request, like do that more softly, or like do it like this, or I like it like that. And then like positive reinforcement where you're like, yes, that feels really good. That stuff is like really hot and people respond to it, and then they know what's working, especially if they're not getting a lot of like physical or like vocal confirmation. Not everyone's loud or like gonna moan and stuff, right? So it's a really good thing to look into and build sort of your own, I think, style of communication around, because it's just not worth it to suffer in silence. And like, I know for a fact, like I've experienced this in my younger years. I know other people who've gone through this where like, especially in bed, you will have something that you've never communicated to your partner that they consistently do wrong or don't do, that you just deal with. And like, that's not worth it. That is not worth it, because you can eradicate that in one conversation. And it would be hard to, after a few years, to be like, by the way.
Exactly. You don't want it to get to that point, right?
No. I mean, I'm sure like there's a way to go about that if it gets to it. Like it can probably still be a healing
totally,
you know, situation or discussion, but like, don't let yourself suffer in silence, you know?
Agreed. Yeah, we can get so in our heads about these things, and it's like, have the conversation, express it, like do something, try a different way of behaving than what you would normally do. If you normally wouldn't say anything, start saying something, start noticing like, okay, are they reacting in the way that I thought they would, or is it completely fine? Even if there is a moment of awkwardness, like that's gonna go pretty quick because you're in the middle of having sex. You know what I mean?
Some
like
awkward moments during sex anyway.
Exactly.
Like happen all the time. And like you said, there are conversations that people might have prior to sleeping together, regardless. Like you might be talking about like health and STDs. You might be talking about condoms and like different things. So maybe you rope in a conversation about what you each enjoy. I think it's actually amazing and like hot and, you know, inspiring to, if it's someone that, you know, you're going to sleep with and you just haven't yet, and you guys are talking and building that relationship. I think it's really sexy to kind of like ask those questions and be like, what do you enjoy in bed? Like, what do you not enjoy?
Totally.
I love hearing that shit. And then you have a primer for when the time comes and you're good to go.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah. I've had some really great conversations because I brought that up, and like sometimes the reaction is a little awkward at first, but it's like, no, but this is legit. Like I'm talking to you and I plan on eventually having sex with you. Kind of want to know what you're into. And if there's any fantasies that you have, like, let me know. because maybe it's really important for that person to find someone to like be their mommy in bed, and that's a no-go for me, right? Like, wouldn't they want to know that up front? Something that's cool, an app that I've recently explored, which is called Field, which is all about finding people to connect with in different ways, but there's like a huge sexual undertone. But you're very upfront with what your sexual preferences are, what you're looking for, what your desires are, what you're attracted to. Like, I love it. I'm like, this should, like, people should be wearing signs, or at least on every dating app, this is what I'm into. And it allows for such beautiful, transparent conversation. And like, what you're getting yourself into.
Like I have a literal example of like coming across somebody who, for example, is just not like not a breast person. Like they're just like, I don't pay attention to breasts. I don't care about that. I don't care about nipples. And to me, that's like very, very important.
Yeah.
Like that needs a lot of attention, a lot. And if I was in bed with somebody and they were paying no attention to that area, and I think I've been in that situation before, that's where it came from. And God, I don't remember, it must have been a long time ago because I don't even remember who or when. But I think I was just like, like after the fact, I was kind of trying to figure out like what the deal is. But they were like, yeah, I'm just not into breasts at all. And my personal experiences with people not enjoying, like women not enjoying that attention. I was like, what?
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
And so I think that because we all come from so many different like sexual experiences and partners who like, yes, there's like baseline things that we can all really connect on, but there's a lot of people who enjoy different kinds of things and will naturally just kind of like, I don't know, like do what we're used to with our next partner. We don't necessarily change it up till we start adapting to a new person, right?
Totally.
So you don't just know exactly what somebody else is gonna enjoy.
Exactly. And we're all different, you know? Okay, so there's a few more things they're going to talk about. So maybe we can just like touch upon them quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So noticing when your boundaries are violated. Okay, so it was sometimes people don't notice, person doesn't notice that their boundaries are being not met until it's like far along.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because I know it's coming.
Yeah, my understanding is like, and I've had this happen with myself too, where almost like the way I've experienced it is you're just, I don't know, like all of a sudden I'll just be overwhelmed with a lot of emotion and I'll feel really low and not really know why.
Mm-hmm.
And when I like look back and unravel it, I realize like, okay, I don't know, either let's say with a relationship, I've allowed this person to repeatedly cross this boundary and like now I'm like so upset and so agitated and so stressed out and overwhelmed that I have to like shut the world out. Um and that either helps me realize that there was a boundary in the first place that's been crossed that I never identified or communicated. Um or another way it can happen for me is that I have repeatedly violated my own boundary and I just feel like shit about it. So like, let's say something like my phone use, if I've like spent days on end, sitting for hours scrolling through an app and just like feeling listless and down and, uninspired. It's like 3 or 4 days later, I might just be like, I feel absolutely brutal, you know? And I look back and it's like, well, I've been consistently violating this boundary for like 3 days. That's how I understand it. I'm not
Yeah.
sure exactly if the person meant it in any of these ways, but where you can almost just not be conscious or aware of like a boundary that's either being crossed by somebody else or that you're crossing within yourself. Or maybe there's some like self delusion going on with that as well, where we're just like, no, it's okay. Like how you mentioned the example of not watching, I think it was not watching anything
TV
past
after a
11.
certain time. Yeah.
You could be like, oh, like, you know, it's a good movie. And like, so you stay out till 2 a.m. for the next 3 nights watching TV, but then you feel horrible and you realize it's because you've been like repeatedly ignoring that boundary.
Yeah, I feel like I think it comes kind of down to sticking to your boundaries and how that can be challenging. And it's really reminding yourself that you set those boundaries in the first place to benefit you, to take care of you, to love you, that you don't just like set boundaries to make yourself suffer. Because I know sometimes we could have these tendencies where it's like, oh, if it's a rule, I want to break it. There's this like rebellious side to us. But don't think of them as rules, just think of them as guidelines to loving and supporting yourself. And you know, like we do know when we're crossing a boundary. Maybe we don't realize it in the moment because it's so ingrained in our coping mechanism, right? Like when I have shitty days, like I eat McDonald's French fries, and it's like you forgot that you set a boundary around eating food that made you feel crap or and whatnot. So I think when it comes to like sticking to your boundaries, it's really being in integrity with yourself and being like, I'm going to take care of myself and I'm going to honor the guidelines that I set for myself, because I know when I do, there will be positive results to it. And I know when I don't, there will be negative. So like let's try and like stick to these boundaries as much as possible, because I know when I won't, that I'm not going to feel great. So I think it's like kind of what you were saying is when you start noticing yourself not feeling good, maybe then looking back and doing like a quick inventory on your day or your past few days and being like, oh, where did I fall off?
Exactly.
And that could help clarify kind of where your boundaries, where you weren't meeting your own boundaries.
Yeah, I think it helps a lot because I think I've also experienced it with like if there's some negative, if there's like, let's say there's people like loved ones in my life who are just like, and I've done this too, but like they're in a bad space and they just need to rant. And they're kind of like, their communication is maybe more negative, and instead of like, instead of kind of drawing a boundary around that, like I've had it with certain family members, right? Where I'm just like, okay, like I don't feel like it's in my best interest to carry on a conversation with this person today because it's making me feel really down and negative. But then there's a part of me that's like, well, I love them and I want to be there for them and do that for them. So like, let's say I decide, okay, like I'm going to have a phone call, and then I end up sitting for 3 hours on the phone with them, going on and on about something really heavy and like just spewing their day and like all of that, which in the right space and with the right framework, like I love inviting someone to rant and just like dump their shit on me, just like I might on somebody else who's willing, as like a loving exchange. Like, I need to rant. Is that okay? Like, let's do this. Right. But in this situation, let's say I've just like, you know, this person doesn't really recognize that and maybe doesn't respect the boundaries I have around that. And so out of guilt, I've made myself available. And then so after that phone call, I'm feeling really, really drained and resentful and upset and hurt. And so, like, that's a case where I have very, very severely violated my own boundary, but I was aware that I was doing it. You know, like you said, like, you know when you're crossing it. So you just have to really honor honor yourself and put a foot down and protect your energy.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's for your own well-being, your own safety, your own happiness, like, and your ability to be a more receptive, loving person for other people. Because if you don't want to talk after 9 p.m., but I'm forcing you to talk to me every night after 9 p.m., you're not going to be happy with me.
Right.
And we're
Exactly.
not going to have a good relationship. So, like,
Yeah.
it enables you to be, to show up more lovingly for the people in your life than
Mm-hmm.
if you, out of guilt, consistently violate your boundary to meet them where they want you to show up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. So, based on everything that we talked about today, what is something like, what is the path to self-exploration that we can offer people listening or watching, in exploring their own boundaries? Something really simple, um, whether it's in the sexual area or not.
Mm-hmm.
Our animals are just making all the noises.
Yeah.
Like, my dog is stressing me out right now, just like crying behind the door.
Is she?
Yeah,
Oh,
just whining for the past hour. Yeah, what is something that we can offer the listeners to work
yeah.
with?
So I think in the first episode, we like the first part of boundaries.
Yeah.
I think my ask was, or my takeaway was like to look back and write down boundaries that you feel have been violated, right? So I wonder. So I would say that, um, for this episode or for this continuing conversation, to write down what your boundaries are. Like, just do a list, like, list as many things that come to mind in as many areas of your life, like almost like you're just brainstorming or compiling a quick list. Like, don't put too much thought into it. But any boundary that comes to mind for you that you can identify. Like, again, like maybe you don't want to talk to anyone after 10 p.m. at night. Maybe you don't want to eat fast food more than once a week. Um, maybe you don't want to talk on the phone more than 3 times a week. Like, whatever it is, it doesn't mean that all of these are for sure, that you need to start communicating them. Just like start to compile a list of anything and everything you can think of, and it'll just help you kind of practice what sort of boundaries you might already be aware of or contemplating.
Mm,
And some of them might be a surprise to you. And yeah.
I love that. I love that. And I think something that I would offer is maybe think about a boundary that you had set where you didn't get the reaction that you wanted.
Mm.
And going back to that and asking yourself, what was it like in my childhood when I set boundaries? And have there been other scenarios that resulted in a similar reaction in my life? And reflect on that. And then maybe ask yourself, well, what can I do to change that? Is it changing the people? Is it changing the way that I approach it? How do I want people to respond to my boundaries? And then
Mm.
be in that energy.
I love that. I think that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for our chat today. It's been so great talking about boundaries, so needed.
Yeah.
Um, we will have a poll for our next episode topics, which we'll share very soon.
Mhm.
And yeah, happy boundary setting in 2021. May this be the year where you're just on lock with those boundaries.
Absolutely. Oh my God, I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Thank you.